G'day, this is Kareem with Does It Matter? I'm sporting rather a nasty cold today, so you'll have to bear with me with the nasality and so on. But there's been quite a few things on my mind, as there usually are, and I wanted to at least briefly address some of these more topical issues. And after listening to some very interesting people on Sam Harris's podcast, um, who kind of confirmed the direction that I've been thinking for quite some time, is that I think a lot of people are disturbed by the growth of factionalism, tribalism. They're trends that are actually historical features of societies that are complexifying, that become relatively affluent compared to previous societies, and relatively powerful. They have a tendency, as they agglomerate and get stronger and larger and more complex and incorporate more people, have a tendency to do two things. And those two things are not separate by any stretch of the imagination. They tend to begin to concentrate wealth in the hands of a smaller and smaller percentage of the people in that society. And they begin to factionalize and tribalize, i.e., the national identities of the people within those states becomes fragmented, and people feel less and less loyalty and a sense of service and identity with the state and with the nation that the state is meant to be running, and more with whatever they particularly tend to identify with. And that's where we run into the pernicious nature of identity politics. Identity politics actually makes sense if you're in the 1960s and you're Black African American or a minority fighting for human rights, fighting for freedom, fighting for equality, or a woman suffragette from the 20s or earlier right up to now, and you're trying to get elements of equality held back from you, then absolutely you're gonna want to use identity politics to equalize, to make things fair. Okay, get the same privileges, the same attitudes, the same money, the same funding that everyone else has. The problem is that the victim bandwagon is a seductive one. And an awful lot of people can hop onto that bandwagon with a grievance that they then expand beyond its scope. Okay, they draw false equivalencies, start saying things like words are violence. Words have weight, yes, words can hurt. They're not violence, all right? Unless you've been punched in the face, unless you've ever been assaulted or brutalized, you have no fucking idea what you're talking about. People who say words of violence enrage me beyond belief, which is ironic considering the topic. But words are not violence. Words are hurtful sometimes. Words are powerful, okay? I write, I do podcasts, words are my stock and trade, but words are not violence, okay? Violence is violence. Someone forces you, uses a monopoly of force against you, that's violence. Nothing else. Everything else is in its own category. It's another thing. And that's part of the laziness, the intellectual laziness, the lack of rigor that have crept into both the left and the right, especially on the far fringes that seem to get all the media attention. This lack of intellectual rigor, this complete ideological rewrite of people's ability to think critically. Pardon me. So, returning to from this tangent, tribalism, factionalism, money being concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people, even though everyone is involved in the means of production, everyone is involved in the process of both consuming, producing, and expanding the economy. We're all part of that. We're all players in it. These are the signs, incipient signs of societies that are pushing towards a bottleneck where so much of the money will make its way into the hands of the wealthy, that you are headed towards sort of 19th century Britain as its empire is beginning to wind down. You're headed towards the last days of the Roman Empire. You're heading towards societies where wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of so few people, and so many people were deprived of representation, deprived of basic needs, deprived of health and services, deprived of the ability to even earn income. And we are headed towards that at this point in time. Thomas Piketty, in his book Modern Capital, was able to show clearly that that's the case, and he's joined by more liberal economists like Stiglitz, Lester Thoreau, and others who are saying the same thing, and have been saying it for quite some time, that it's a feature of our society, that our economy, that we need to get a handle on, and we need to do it fairly quickly. Much like our need to repair the ecology, prevent any further damage to it, deal with climate change, these things have a time limit. They all have a time limit, upon which we now move into an area where we can no longer prevent a certain amount of damage occurring. And a civilized society is a society that's able to function in more than electoral increments, okay? More than every 3 or 4 years, more than 8 years. It has to think in terms of decades and even centuries. It has to think in terms of generational capacity and the impacts that will be felt by future generations. But our system increasingly is built upon financial quarters. It's built upon a temporal scheme that's so short term that we are constantly battling with powerful forces within society, largely corporate, banking, and so on, but even government forces, governmental forces that are thinking about the next election, not thinking about the next generation, but the next election. These are issues, structural issues, that we need to address, the same as we need to address our rampant effect on the ecology and our effects on meteorology of the planet. If we don't deal with those things, they come back to haunt us 10 times over, 100 times over down the track. I mean, we're just storing up more suffering for later. Doesn't make any sense to me. A little suffering now, or none even, in fact, burgeoning new economies, sounds like a pretty good option compared to waiting and waiting, and then later on having to do some fairly drastic things in order to, after an already a ton of suffering, in order to fix the core problem. All of this is leading to the growth of factionalism, the loss of faith in institutions. If I don't believe in the courts, I don't believe in Parliament, I don't think that the Senate's able to filter as a house of review, if I don't believe in those things anymore, if I think the police are all corrupt and rotten, if I think that racism is endemic through my society and bigotry of different kinds, if I also have become a professional victim or a professional indignant, and unfortunately there are plenty of those people who conflate, confuse, and muddy the waters of serious problems with their own egos, with their own false equivalencies, like saying words of violence and equating someone being raped with someone else being spoken to harshly, and they're saying that those are equivalent, and that is literally word for word what you'll find on the internet over and over again in the media. People making these false equivalencies, they muddy the water. They actually detract from real victims. They detract from more serious victims anyway, and they make an awful lot of people who are not committed, and that's the majority, not committed to a particular ideological view, extremely resistant and leery of looking at progressive policies, because they hear this craziness coming right out of the far left. Okay, they're coming out of progressive policies. They hear these fringe ideas, and that makes them more vulnerable to alt-right ideas. That makes them more vulnerable to, and the alt-right is far more dangerous in the long run. The world is populated largely by conservatives. The reality is that most people are conservative still, to some degree, on a sliding scale, of course. And the alt-right is going to be more attractive to some of them than progressive left. And it's certainly going to be more attractive to them if all they're hearing is trigger warnings, microaggressions. They're hearing the zaniness that comes out of a lot of left politics. Just the imbalance too, the refusal to consider alternative points of view, the assumptions behind that far left point of view. Okay, some people like Jordan Peterson say that they're all Marxists, and I'm certain that that's probably true to some degree. But I think it's more likely it's just a feature of human nature that you've supported a particular point of view for a very long time. You've built an academic career in it. You tend to want to proselytize to your students, and as a result, many of those students will just absorb that. Many of them will ignore it. Most of them will just do what they need to do to get their marks. But there's always that fringe that take it on board without much critical thinking, without the ability to regard for context, nuance, and you have another generation of professors and extreme academics that drive the majority of conservative people on this planet away from the left, away from the centre and the left and progressive values, which I firmly believe in, and they drive them towards the alt-right. That isn't going to stop until we've done a couple of things, and I think that the core of that is that we've got to get people believing in each other again. And then once people are able to start to recognize that, the person who voted for Trump isn't your enemy. The person who voted for Trump are often Rust Belters, people whose parents used to be quite well off and who remember as children being reasonably well off and benefiting from the boom of the 60s, 70s, and in the early 80s. And then it all came to a crashing halt. And since the late 80s and the early 90s, they've seen it get progressively worse. Till now, many of them are poor as sin and have seen the employment leave their areas. They've seen the drop in their lifestyles. They've seen the growth of particular areas in their countries, densely urban areas, and they feel inaccurately, but they feel isolated and picked on and marginalised. Were they to visit some aspects of some areas and cities, particularly in Sydney here or Baltimore in the US, they would find out that they had many brothers and sisters in the same condition in their urban developments. But nonetheless, they feel isolated, marginalised, and ignored. And to some degree, they were. They were told their services were no longer needed in large numbers, and those services were now used in Asian countries in New International Division of Labour. Labour moved over to where it was cheaper. The capital moved its factories to where it was cheaper, where the labour was cheaper. And the sense of betrayal that a lot of people right from the north of the UK, the Rust Belt in America, here in Australia as well, loss of manufacturing-based textiles, it's had huge impacts on employment. Our ability to employ hundreds of thousands of millions of people, tens of millions in some cases, has been reduced dramatically. So people have lost faith. They've lost faith, and they've heard politicians lie and lie and lie. The inveterate liar, Trump. And here in Australia, we've had just a plethora of politicians on both sides of the fence. Now, the Conservative side, the Liberal National Party, certainly trump everyone else in terms of lying, but they're not alone. I mean, politicians do lie. And when they flip-flop, instead of being honest about the fact that they've changed their mind, which they're perfectly entitled to do and they should be able to do, they make excuses up and they feed into the flip-flop accusation. I think politicians should be able to change their mind. They should be able to, but they should be changing their mind based on evidence. They should have made their mind up to begin with based on evidence. If it's just populism driving their choices and they're flip-flopping back and forth, that is a valid criticism. And so the waters are muddied by ideology, by populist politicians seeking just to get in, and also keeping their lobbyists in power and happy. Those lobbyists contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to the last few campaigns in our national elections, and they do so all over the world. They have disproportionate representation in our houses of parliament. They have disproportionate representation in our economies. They are driving monopolies that are forming in all our economies. We're seeing a diminishment in growth of competition. We're seeing a growth of corporate monopolies, and we're seeing a disproportionate influence on government by these large conglomerates, and it's not being addressed, and the public can see it. They recognize the fact that there's gross corruption going on that is being largely ignored, and it's certainly being ignored by the system itself. So when you have a system that doesn't represent people anymore and seems to ignore them and have a kind of subtle contempt for a lot of us, that's going to lead to that loss of faith in institutions, loss of faith in the system itself. And that's very dangerous, because that's driving the factionalism and the tribalism and the splitting apart of society. I'm all for diversity in society, plurality. I'm a multicultural person myself. I believe fundamentally that multicultural policies are the future. They're right now. They're our existent reality, and they're only going to get more multicultural, more diverse as time goes by. But those multicultural societies are a ticking time bomb if people start to think and identify deeply with identity politics instead of some sense of overall humanism. And this is why I'm a humanist, because the fundamental reality is that we share far more similarities than dissimilarities as men, women, and as multiple cultures. Okay, far more. We're humans. Before we're men, before we're women, before we're anything else, we are human beings. We are part of a superorganism called the human race. And that is our identity as individuals within that superorganism. A perfect balance or blend, ideally, of individual and collective. No one dominant, but each one mutually interdependent. We're going to lose that over the next few decades. We're going to have a lot of suffering if we don't address that growth of division within society. I mean, argument is great, okay, but we're losing the ability, as one article I read recently about the art of disagreement, we're losing the ability to disagree with each other civilly. We're losing the ability to accept different points of view. We're losing the ability to understand the other person's point of view deeply before you disagree with them. It's become an ideological blasting of your views over the top of other people, and cherry picking their ideas, cherry picking via criticisms instead of deeply addressing any flaws that you think are in their thinking. But to deeply address them, you have to understand them. And it's rare that I see the kind of civil discourse that leads to exposure of flaws in both participants' thinking. It's usually attempts to win the argument. And the problem with winning an argument is that it falsely represents what's happening, okay? And it tends to drive both parties into a adversarial tangent, this hyper adversarialism that's promulgated right across the network, the internet, and throughout society and the media. If it bleeds, it leads. It's got to be violent. It's got to be confrontational. It's got to be nasty. It's got to be, all irrational passions. There's no logic to it. There's no contemplation. There's no reflection. And that makes me angry. Again, ironic. We're really smart monkeys. We're really smart primates. And we have to be aware of that. I mean, that's where a lot of this political stuff starts to move onto the neuroscience and the way our brains work and the way we process information and our knee-jerk anthropological inclinations towards certain things. But yeah, I think that we fundamentally need to address our loss of faith in these things, and we need to improve them. We can't just run an ad campaign and go, hey, everything's better now. It's not better now. I mean, our economies are increasingly favouring the rich over the poor, or over everyone else. We've got automation and AI that are going to replace unbelievable chunks of the population, white collar as well as blue collar now. We're moving into an era where simply we're going to have 8 to 10 billion people by mid-century, and we're not going to be able to employ most of those people. And I mean most of those people will not have a job for most of their lives. They will not have permanent full-time work. It's just not going to exist. But we're going to need a consumer market. We're going to need people to have income to live and live well. The UBI is a good step in that right direction, but the problem with that is it needs to be paired up to a whole bunch of social services so that you've got this unconditional basic income, but you've also got a ton of social services, lots of public housing, affordable, cheap housing, lots of things that enable that UBI to be worth more than just an anti-destitution model, because the anti-destitution model just creates a massive enfranchised class of poor. And yeah, I mean, if you wanted to design a violent revolution, that's the way you go about it. That's the way you go about it. Make everyone really, really poor, give them just enough to survive, or not quite enough in that case, and then wait, boom, powder keg made. So the UBI on its own isn't going to be enough. It's going to need to be significantly more generous than most of the models I've seen that are emerging from Holland and Finland and elsewhere. It's also going to have to be paired to a whole raft of free social services, high quality ones, so that people don't need that much money to live. Okay? Again, if they're not able to have a significant amount of disposable income to pour back into the consumer economy, we've got a problem. If people aren't able to imagine dreaming, creating their own entrepreneurs, I can see the world being driven by a much higher level of entrepreneurial skills, more academics, more people learning, and that's where we could be going. But it's going to have to be carefully constructed, very carefully considered, and it's going to need funding. It's going to need both quantitative easing, it's going to need taxation, it's going to need a whole rafter of measures in place, and it can be done. The Americans poured $6 trillion of quantitative easing during the GFC into the economy, which they're clawing $3.6 trillion back over the next 5 years. But they poured $6 trillion into that. But the problem was that most of the money went onto the balance sheets of the very rich companies and banks. They didn't pour their money into the people losing their homes. Millions of people losing homes. They didn't pour their money into businesses, small businesses that were suffering and going under. They didn't pour their money into the ground floor of the economy, and I think that was their big mistake, and it was what Australia did with our relatively small GFC payments. But they poured into the economy, gave it to people, okay? Not to large institutions who are just going to rectify their balance sheets and then continue business as usual, which is what had happened. And it's why our GFC payments, our GFC measures were much more successful than any other countries, because the money went to the people that needed it, and it also went to the fundamental ground floor, the coalface of the economy. That's the general approach that we're going to need to take over the coming decades, is in terms of addressing inequality and preventing the rise of terrible, terrible factionalism and tribalism, which is already beginning and is the incipient child of something we do not want to grow up. We don't want that thing to grow up. We need to abort that well and truly. That'll be all for today on this issue. I'll be talking soon about climate change, and I'll also be talking about science and technology and where I think that's taking us over the next 4 or 5 decades, and some of the misnomers and misunderstandings that people have there. That's all, and thank you for listening to me on Does It Matter?